10:18 p.m. The emergency room of a massive Houston hospital is a war zone of sirens and stress. Suddenly, the heavy double doors are slammed open with a violent crash. A massive man, nearly 7 feet tall and built like a mountain, storms inside. His face is a mask of pure rage and sweat. He screams for a doctor, his voice shaking the glass partitions. Other patients shrink back in terror. Security guards reach for their radios, their bodies tensing for a fight. But as everyone else retreats, rookie nurse Sarah Miller, only 24 years old, steps forward. She asks quietly, "Sir, tell me what's wrong." Sarah Miller had been a registered nurse for exactly 3 weeks. In the intricate, often brutal hierarchy of the Houston Memorial Emergency Department, 3 weeks meant you were essentially a ghost in scrubs. You were the one assigned to the lowest priority tasks, fetching extra pillows, emptying suction canisters, or cleaning up the spills that the more senior staff didn't have the time or the inclination to touch. You were the one who stood in the back of the trauma bay during a high-stakes code, watching the real professionals work with a mixture of awe and terrifying imposter syndrome. Sarah was small, barely 5'3", and possessed a youthful porcelain face that made patients and colleagues alike constantly ask if she was a high school volunteer. To the veteran charge nurses who had seen it all, and the jaded attending physicians who lived on a diet of black coffee and adrenaline, Sarah was just a rookie. She still had the smell of crisp textbooks and fresh laundry on her. She hadn't yet been hardened by the endless stream of human tragedy that flowed through the Houston streets. She had grown up in a small town in East Texas, a place where everyone knew your name, and the hospital was a quiet building where people went to heal peacefully. Moving to Houston had been a shock to her system. The city was a sprawling, vibrating monster, and the ER was its beating, bruised heart. The night shift was particularly brutal. Houston was trapped in the grip of a relentless August heat wave. The humidity was so thick it felt like breathing through a warm, wet blanket. Outside, the air smelled of exhaust fumes and asphalt. Inside, the ER was overflowing with the city's chaos. It was a Saturday night, the witching hour for emergency medicine. There was a 6-car pileup on the I-10, a high school football star with a compound fracture, and 3 cases of acute abdominal pain that had all arrived in the same 10-minute window. The air was a heavy cocktail of industrial-grade lavender cleaner, old coffee, and the metallic, unmistakable tang of fresh blood. Every single bed was taken, and the hallways were lined with gurneys holding patients who were either groaning in pain or staring at the ceiling in a drug-induced fog. Sarah had been running for 6 hours straight, her cheap nursing clogs squeaking against the linoleum, her mind a whirlwind of vital signs, lab requests, and discharge papers. Then, the world stopped. The bang was so violent it sounded like a structural failure. When the heavy, double-reinforced steel doors flew open, the entire room seemed to physically contract. The man who entered didn't just walk in, he invaded the space. He was a literal giant, nearly 7 feet of raw muscle and bone. He was wearing a grease-stained work shirt that looked 2 sizes too small for his shoulders, heavy steel-toed boots that left dusty prints on the floor, and his face was a terrifying mask of sweat and crimson rage. "I need a doctor," he roared, the sound vibrating through the acoustic ceiling tiles. "Now! Someone look at me right now!" The lobby went dead silent. A toddler who had been crying stopped mid-sob. The head of hospital security, a retired Houston police officer named Mike, immediately stepped into the man's path. Mike was a big guy himself, but next to this giant, he looked like a child. Mike's hand hovered near his belt, his body tensing for a physical altercation. "Sir, you need to back up and calm down," Mike said, his voice hard and practiced. "We cannot have you screaming in the triage area. If you don't lower your voice, I'm going to have to escort you out of the building. Do you understand?" The giant turned on Mike, his fists clenching so tight the veins in his forearms looked like they were about to burst through the skin. "Don't you tell me to calm down," he shouted back, leaning into Mike's personal space. "I said I need help. I'm not leaving until a doctor looks at me." The tension was a physical weight in the room. The triage nurses were reaching for their emergency silent alarms. The doctors in the back were looking for a reason not to come out. Most of the staff were looking for a place to duck, or waiting for the inevitable moment when Mike would have to use his taser. But Sarah Miller, standing just 5 feet away near the charting station, didn't see a threat. She didn't see a disturbing the peace charge. She had been trained by an old grizzled clinical instructor back in school who told her, "Fear wears many masks, Sarah. Usually it looks like anger. Your job is to look behind the mask." While the others saw a security problem, Sarah saw a patient in crisis. She noticed the way the man was leaning subtly to his right. She saw the fine, oily sheen of cold sweat on his forehead, a sweat that was different from the heat-induced perspiration of the night outside. She saw his left hand, which was white-knuckled and trembling, clutching the thick fabric of his work shirt right over his sternum. His eyes weren't just angry. They were dilated and darting, searching for an exit from his own body. She stepped forward, placing herself between the security guard and the giant bear of a man. It was a visual that would be talked about in the break room for years. A tiny 24-year-old rookie standing in the shadow of a mountain of a man. "Sir," she said, her voice low, steady, and remarkably devoid of fear. "My name is Sarah. I'm one of the nurses here. I can see you're in a lot of pain. Tell me, did the pain start suddenly?" The giant froze. The roar died in his throat. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced for a split second by a look of absolute, raw, primal terror. He looked down at the small woman in the light blue scrubs. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. His breathing was coming in jagged, shallow, whistling gasps. "I was driving," he rasped, his voice dropping from a roar to a broken whisper. "It hit me. It hit me like a sledgehammer. My chest. It feels like there's a 10-ton anchor sitting right on my ribs. I can't get the air in." Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Mike for permission. She didn't wait for a doctor's signature or for the registration desk to get a social security number. She grabbed a nearby heavy-duty wheelchair and locked the brakes. "Sit down, Robert," she said, taking a guess at the man's name from a small patch on his shirt. "Sit down right now. I'm taking you to bed 4. We're going to find out exactly what's happening, and we're going to do it right now." The senior nurses watched in stunned silence as the rookie led the monster into the high acuity zone of the ER. They whispered about a lack of protocol and safety violations. They expected the man to erupt again, but Sarah wasn't listening to the whispers of the room. She was listening to the rhythmic, agonizing struggle of the man's heart. "If you think people are sometimes judged too quickly," type, "that's unfair." Inside the small curtained sanctuary of bed 4, the giant man looked remarkably small for the first time. His name was indeed Robert, a construction foreman who had spent the last 20 years lifting steel beams and managing the toughest crews in the city. He was a man built of iron and grit, but now he was trembling like a leaf in a storm. The hospital gown he was asked to put on didn't even cover half of his chest. Sarah moved with a mechanical, quiet efficiency that completely belied her 3 weeks of experience. In that small space, the world outside, the sirens, the shouting, the heat, ceased to exist. There was only the monitor, the patient, and the nurse. She strapped the oversized blood pressure cuff on his massive bicep. She clipped the pulse oximeter onto his calloused finger, and she began to meticulously hook up the 12 cardiac monitor leads across his chest. "Robert, I need you to try and take slow, deep breaths for me," she said, her hands steady as she applied the adhesive patches. "I know it's hard. I know it feels like you're fighting for air. Just focus on my voice. We've got you." The monitor chirped to life, and the first wave of data hit the screen. The numbers were a clinical nightmare. Blood pressure, 182/114, heart rate, 124 and irregular, skipping beats in a dangerous, chaotic rhythm. Oxygen saturation, 91%. Robert was in the middle of a systemic, catastrophic collapse. "My arm," Robert groaned, his eyes rolling back slightly as his head hit the thin hospital pillow. It feels like it's falling asleep. The left one. It's tingling all the way down to my fingertips. And my jaw. It feels like it's being crushed in a vice. Sarah's heart skipped its own beat, radiating pain to the left arm and jaw, crushing substernal pressure, diaphoresis, in a sudden, violent onset. Every page of every textbook she had ever memorized was screaming at her. This wasn't a panic attack. This wasn't a man who was angry or aggressive because he wanted to be. This was a man whose heart was literally suffocating. He was experiencing a massive cardiac event. Dr. Sterling, the senior attending physician, pushed through the curtains. Sterling was a man who prided himself on ER efficiency. He was already annoyed by the chaos in the lobby and was looking for someone to blame. Sarah, why is this man in a trauma bed? Registration says he hasn't been triaged. We have 3 ambulance arrivals from the interstate pileup waiting in the bay. We don't have room for people who walk in off the street shouting. Sarah didn't look up from the monitor. She didn't flinch at the doctor's tone. She simply pointed at the red numbers on the screen. Dr. Sterling, this is Robert. He has crushing substernal chest pain that started suddenly while he was driving. It's radiating to his left arm and jaw. He's tachycardic, hypertensive, and his oxygen is dropping. I've already started him on 4 liters of high-flow oxygen, and I am running a 12-lead ECG right now. Sterling paused. He looked at the giant on the bed, then at the monitor, then back at Sarah. He had intended to order Mike to take the man to the waiting room for a psych evaluation. But something about the way the rookie nurse was standing, her shoulders back, her eyes locked on the telemetry, no hesitation in her hands made him stop. He saw the notch on the ECG tracing that only a trained eye would catch. Do it, Sterling commanded, his voice losing its edge of annoyance and replacing it with clinical urgency. Run the full 12 lead. I want a stat troponin level, a CMP, and a portable chest X-ray. Get the pharmacy to send up an aspirin and a nitro drip. Now! As the ECG machine began to produce the long, white, rhythmic strip of paper, the other staff members began to drift toward the curtains of bed 4. They had all heard about the giant who had stormed the ER. They had expected to see a fight, a struggle, a security incident. Instead, they saw a quiet, focused medical operation. They saw Sarah Miller, the girl they had thought was a ghost, acting as the absolute anchor of the room. She was the one who found a vein for the large bore IV on her first try, even as Robert's blood pressure made his veins difficult to access. She was the one who explained every single step to Robert, keeping him grounded in reality while his body was trying to pull him into the dark. You're doing great, Robert, she whispered, leaning close so he could hear her over the rising noise of the sirens outside. The doctor is here. The machines are working. We are catching this early. You were smart to come in when you did. The rookie was no longer just the one fetching ice or changing linens. She was the reason this man was still breathing. She had saved the golden minutes, the precious time that stands between survival and permanent heart damage. She had done it by refusing to wait for the man's anger to subside, and by realizing that his rage was just the sound of a man screaming for his life. The veteran nurses began to look at each other with a collective sense of humility. They realized that they had almost let a man die in the parking lot because they were too busy looking at the size of his fists instead of the state of his heart. If you realize the rookie nurse might have saved precious time, type, I was wrong. The ECG strip finished printing with a low, rhythmic, mechanical buzz. Dr. Sterling snatched it from the machine before it even touched the floor. His eyes scanned the peaks and valleys of the ink with the intensity of a man reading a death warrant. His face went pale. ST elevation in the lateral leads, Sterling muttered, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. It's a lateral STEMI. We have a total blockage in the main artery. He's a ticking time bomb. Notify the cath lab immediately. Tell them we're moving a 250-pound male in 5 minutes. No delays. The atmosphere in Bed 4 shifted from emergency assessment to all-out war. A swarm of technicians, respiratory therapists, and surgical prep nurses descended on the area. Robert was being prepped for emergency surgery to clear the blockage in his heart. The room was a whirlwind of activity, the sound of scissors cutting through his work shirt, the beep of the infusion pumps, the sharp commands of the doctors. But through all the noise, Robert's eyes never left Sarah. In the middle of the storm, she was his only constant. "Sarah," he rasped, reaching out a massive, shaking hand. His hand was so large it completely enveloped hers, a contrast of strength and fragility. "Sarah, am I going to die? Be honest with me." Sarah squeezed his hand back, her grip firm and human. She didn't give him a fake smile. She gave him the truth. "Not today, Robert. Not on my watch. We found the problem. The best surgeons in Houston are waiting for you upstairs. They're going to fix it. I'll be right here until they wheel you into that elevator." As they waited for the transport team to arrive, the high-flow oxygen started to settle Robert's breathing just enough for him to speak. He spoke in a low, broken, gravelly voice that made the room go silent. "I lost my younger brother in January," he whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust and sweat on his cheek. "Same thing happened. He was at a grocery store, and his chest started to burn. He started shouting. He started getting loud because he couldn't get a full breath, and he was scared. The manager called the police because they thought he was a drunk or high and causing a scene. They didn't see a sick man. They saw a problem." The silence that hit the room was absolute. Even the senior doctors stopped their charting. "The police arrived," Robert continued, his voice trembling. "They tackled him. They put him in the back of a squad car. He died 10 minutes later, face down in the back seat, from a heart attack. No one listened to him. Not one person looked at him and saw that he was dying." Sarah felt a heavy lump in her throat. She could feel the injustice of the brother's story hanging in the air like a cold fog. She realized that Robert hadn't stormed the ER because he was a violent man. He had stormed the ER because he was a grieving man who was fighting for his life in the only way he knew how, by being too loud to be ignored. He was terrified that if he wasn't aggressive, if he wasn't a mountain, he would be treated like a problem and end up like his brother. "I saw you, Robert," Sarah said softly, her eyes wet but her voice steady. "The second you walked through those doors, I saw you and I heard you." When the transport team finally arrived to wheel the heavy gurney toward the surgical suite, Robert looked at Sarah one last time. "Thank you," he said, "for actually looking at me. You're the first person in a long time who didn't look at me like I was a monster." After the gurney disappeared into the elevator and the heavy doors hissed shut, the ER bay felt strangely, hollowly empty. Sarah stood by the unmade bed, her blue scrubs stained with his sweat, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. Dr. Victor Hale, the chief of emergency medicine, had been watching the final moments of the scene from the doorway. Hale was a legend in the Texas medical community, a man who valued clinical precision and surgical excellence above all else. He was the one who had written the protocols that Sarah had technically broken by rushing the man into bed for. He walked over to Sarah, who was already starting to strip the soiled linens from the bed for the next patient. "Nurse Miller," he said, his deep voice echoing through the quiet bay. Sarah stood up straight, her face weary but her eyes bright. "Yes, Dr. Hale." "That was an exceptional catch," Hale said, his tone surprisingly warm. "Getting him in here and on the monitor within 90 seconds of arrival saved his heart muscle. But more than that, you recognize the patient behind the noise. In this department, in a city this loud, that is the hardest skill for any professional to learn. Some veterans never master it. And you've done it in 3 weeks." He turned to the rest of the staff, his gaze sharp and commanding. "Let this be a reminder to all of us tonight. We do not treat checklists. We do not treat security risks. We treat human beings. I want Nurse Miller to lead the debrief at the end of the shift. We all have something to learn from her performance tonight." The justice of the moment was palpable. The veteran nurses who had been dismissive of Sarah earlier now looked at her with a profound, quiet, and well-earned respect. She wasn't just the new girl or the rookie anymore. She was the one who had heard the whisper in the middle of a scream, and in doing so, she had ensured that a hero got to live another day. If you believe listening can be just as important as medical skill, type, "I owe a debt." 4 days later, the atmosphere in the Houston Memorial ER was much lighter. The oppressive heat wave had finally broken, replaced by a cool rain that washed the dust from the streets. The patient volume was manageable, and the monitors were beeping a steady, comforting rhythm. Sarah was at the central nursing station, carefully charting her morning assessments, when the double doors at the entrance opened once again. This time, there was no violent crash, no screaming, no slamming of steel. Robert walked in. He was wearing a clean, pressed denim shirt, and his face was no longer the ashen gray of a dying man. He walked slowly, but he stood taller than ever. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a woman and 2 young boys who looked exactly like him, only smaller. He was carrying a large basket of fresh fruit and a stack of pizzas for the night shift team. He didn't head to triage. He didn't ask for a doctor. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on the small nurse in the blue scrubs. "Nurse Sarah," he called out, his voice still booming, but this time, it was filled with a deep, resonant warmth. Sarah stood up, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. "Robert, you look incredible. Look at you, walking on your own power." Robert reached over the high counter and took her hand, much more gently this time. He held it for a long moment. "The surgeons told me that if I had waited another 20 minutes, or if I had been sent to the waiting room, I wouldn't have made it off the table. They put 2 stents in my main artery. They called it the Widowmaker. I'm going home today because of you." He looked at the other staff members behind the desk, many of whom were the same ones who had been ready to call security and taser him 4 nights ago. "I walked in here angry," Robert said, loud enough for the entire waiting room to hear. "I was scared, I was grieving, and I was a mess. I was ready for a fight because I didn't think anyone would help a man who looked like me. But this young woman, she treated me like a patient, not a problem. She looked past the size of my fists and saw the state of my heart. She gave my boys their father back." He handed the fruit basket to Sarah, and for a moment, the Ice Queen charge nurse actually looked like she was going to cry. As Robert walked out of the ER, he didn't look like a giant anymore. He just looked like a man who had been given the greatest gift in the world, a second chance. The story of Bed 4 became a permanent, foundational part of the hospital's internal lore. It wasn't just a story about a medical save. It was a story about the rookie's view. It became a case study used in orientation for every new nurse and resident. It reminded the veteran doctors that sometimes fresh eyes see the truth that 20 years of experience can blind you to. It reminded the security team that de-escalation begins with a question, not a command. Sarah Miller returned to her work. She still did the basic vitals. She still fetched the ice chips for the patients who were allowed to have them. But something fundamental had changed. When she walked into a room, her colleagues didn't look past her. When she raised a concern during a shift change report, the entire room went dead silent to hear exactly what she had to say. She had moved from being a support asset to being the soul of the unit. She had learned that the most powerful tool in an emergency room isn't the defibrillator or the scalpels. It's the willingness to be the first one to step forward when everyone else is stepping back. If you believe kindness can calm even the most stressful moment, type, "I will live kindly." In a high-volume, high-stress emergency room, success isn't always measured by a complex surgical triumph or a miraculous pharmaceutical discovery. Sometimes, the greatest victory is simply the quiet courage to listen when the world is shouting. This story isn't just about a rookie nurse or a giant man with a failing heart. It's about the quiet professionals who work in our hospitals every single night while the rest of the world is sleeping. We often ignore the Sarah Millers of the world because they don't have the fancy titles, the decades of battle scars, or the loudest voices in the room. We assume that the person with the most seniority always has the clearest view of the monitor. But Sarah Miller proved that the most important person in the room is often the one who is simply paying the most attention to the human being underneath the diagnosis. In every city, in every ER lobby, there are people who walk in feeling completely invisible. They are scared. They are in excruciating pain. And sometimes they express that primal fear through anger, through screaming, or through a difficult attitude. They aren't problems to be managed. They are people who are reaching out for help in the only way they know how. They are fighting for their dignity as much as their life. This is a reminder to all of us. Don't let your seniority, your expertise, or your jadedness blind you to the raw humanity of the person standing in front of you. Don't let the size of someone's fists or the volume of their voice prevent you from seeing the state of their soul. And if you are the rookie, don't let your lack of years or your lack of status intimidate you into silence. Your voice is a clinical tool, and sometimes it is the only tool that can prevent a tragedy from unfolding. Sometimes, the world doesn't need a hero with a cape or a billionaire's bank account. It just needs a nurse with a stethoscope, a calm question, and the courage to stay in the room when everyone else wants to leave. Sarah Miller is still working the night shift in Houston Memorial. The lights are dimmed, the sirens are a distant, haunting echo in the night, and the monitors are beeping their steady, rhythmic lullaby of survival. She stands at the bedside of a new patient, watching the subtle rise and fall of their chest. She is watching the trends. She is listening to the whispers of the machines. But mostly, she is listening to the person. She is a nurse. She is a guardian. She is the code whisperer. And she is the reason a giant got to go home and hold his family tonight. If you believe quiet professionals in our hospitals deserve respect, leave a comment and subscribe to the Veteran Story. These are the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.